Hi everyone, welcome to Off the Podium. We have George Jackson. You remember him from a very early podcast that I did, and he's back and he's doing fantastic conducting and being an awesome musician all around Europe and the world, actually. So, George, welcome to Off the Podium.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to talk to you again.
So, what's new? What have you been up to? That's what I want to know first. What are some of the recent projects that you did? Some of the ones that you remember or are memorable or innovative, interesting. Tell us a little bit about what you've done.
Well, so right now I'm in London at home, and I'm about halfway through a big 6-week production rehearsal schedule for a new Hansel and Gretel, which is at an opera festival just outside London called Grange Park Opera, which is set in a kind of Surrey country type estate. And they've built this opera festival essentially from scratch, this incredible new opera house. And so we're in London right now preparing for that. We're about a week away from moving into the theatre and actually starting to work in their pit and on the stage. So it's quite an exciting time. And that's really been mostly occupying what I've been doing. And so, yeah, lots and lots of work with singers, starting to work with the Orchestra of English National Opera, the ENO Orchestra, next week. And yeah, it's a really exciting project to be involved in.
How is a conductor's role different from an opera conductor and just a orchestral conductor? And I know some of the listeners would know, but for those who don't know what it takes, maybe say a few words about that.
So I think the rhythm of the work is the biggest difference because, you know, with an opera, you're dealing with so many different people involved in different aspects, but also, you know, often you're rehearsing over a long period of time. Usually you'll rehearse, you know, if it's a new production, possibly 5 or 6 weeks before going anywhere near an orchestra or an actual opera house, which is obviously the stage that we're in at the moment. But with an orchestra, with doing a concert, you know, you might show up in some town somewhere. You might have 2 days of rehearsals and then a concert, and that's it. So the proportion of rehearsal preparation hours to performance is actually quite, let's say, similar within an orchestral concept. But actually for opera, it really is a lot of preparation, a lot of work. And I suppose in some cases, you know, 2.5, 3 hour evening at the opera is often more music than a concert. So it's a different rhythm. You find yourself, you know, aiming for where you're going to peak in the journey slightly later in the process than with a concert. You know, usually your first morning with a new orchestra, you really do have to hit the ground running, you know, 10 o'clock in the morning, wake everybody up, be on the ball and be ready to kind of launch the week. But with opera, it's a kind of a slow cooker approach to rehearsing, I think.
Wow. And one thing that is always interesting about you is that you're not afraid to just step up and say things and talk about things that are important in the world of music. And I wanted to know a little bit about your perspective, your ideas about the role of a music director.
hmm I think it's a very, very difficult description of a job, you know, whether it's principal conductor or music director or artistic director, because, of course, every single job or every single orchestra has a different definition of what they expect their music director necessarily to do. But I think, for me, there's a difference between music director and conductor because I think it's a lot more about interacting with a community in the sense that if you're a guest conductor, your main commitment actually is to the musicians of the orchestra. You're designed to put on a concert with them, and your interaction with the community around you is probably not that huge. You might go and eat in a couple of restaurants during the guest conducting week and maybe meet some patrons or donors, but apart from that, you're quite, let's say, absent from the community interaction. Whereas I think a music director, I mean, yes, their commitment is to the orchestral players, but what's most important is that you're the person that directs music in that town or in that community. So it's a very different job, and I think it's probably a job that sort of is much more about people skills and actually interacting with non-musicians and the varied people that make up that community around the orchestra, you know, because it's very, very simple to start thinking about an orchestra just as a group of musicians. You know, obviously it's so much bigger than that.
Yeah, and I'm sure we both have friends, and I personally I work with 5 different organizations as a music director, but all of those organizations are smaller, so that's why I have to kind of work with a bunch of different organizations to actually make a career and make a living. But I'm always impressed and at times surprised with conductors who conduct major symphony orchestras, major opera houses, and they are the principal conductor or the music director of 2 or 3 major organizations. How do they do it? What's your take on this, and how can one manage such a career? It must be so tough.
I mean, I don't know, and I don't know how it's possible. It must be possible. I mean, presumably they sleep 2 hours a night, maybe something like that. But I know there is a big culture at the moment with flying in and flying out, or particularly I've noticed in the United States, there are a lot of conductors that sort of almost collect orchestras, in different regions. So they basically, over their 52-week season or 52 weeks of working per year, they'll basically choose 8 weeks with this orchestra, 8 weeks with another orchestra. And I don't know if that's the healthiest way that musicians can actually do their job, because in a way, you sort of end up spending most of your time on a plane, often doubling up repertoire between the 2 orchestras, which I think it can be quite a useful thing to do as a young conductor. But actually, you end up, I don't know, you kind of expect orchestras to say how used they might feel by somebody who's doing that. There's always that thing. But actually, going back to the term of music director, I just think this idea that you can not only contribute to an orchestra, but also to a community. I mean, that's the biggest thing to ask, and it's a bit like saying, let's get married, but only for 9 weeks a year because I'm going to be with my other wife next. So I understand there's a celebrity culture, and there's also there's probably not that many conductors, really available. It's one of those careers where there aren't that many at the very top, and so of course the demand is very high, like so many leadership positions. But I also think it's unfair on communities to basically share their music director with lots of different people and places, because you probably end up with a kind of watered down version of what you really need. And maybe that's why orchestras are having a tough time, economically in the 21st century, because actually it's the community work that's probably most important. We all know that if you stand in front of a good orchestra, they'll play Brahms too without you. It's not. So there's more to it than that. I'm sure you'll agree with me on that.
Yeah, of course. But it's amazing that you're saying all of this, and I'm so happy you're saying this, because you work with a lot of professional musicians and you're building a great career for yourself. But it's great that you're thinking this way, because I am hoping that orchestras that are listening to you at some point will understand what you bring to the table and how involved you'll be with an organization, whatever that organization might be around the world. But you have great ideas for what it takes to be a music director, and maybe you'll have two. But I'm just I'm just so shocked to see some music directors with 4 or 5 jobs, and some of them happen to be, I know them personally, but it's just shocking. It's impressive and surprising at times. But I wanted to know diving a little bit deeper. You said community and reach out, but what are some things that a music director should be doing in the 21st century to really be involved with the community, with the people, with the youth in the region? What are some things you would do? Oh, I almost feel like this is you're applying to a job with my orchestra or something.
Well, maybe you'll hire me. I don't know. But no, I think it's very difficult because, as I mentioned, most of my work is in Europe, and there's a different relationship between a community and a conductor than there is in the United States or in Asia or in other regions of the world. So I think it's very difficult to give a kind of general answer. But I think, these days, I don't think it's taken for granted that every community gets to have an orchestra. And I feel like one of the things that anybody needs to do, whether it's a music director or a guest conductor, we sort of need to go out there and actually justify why is there an orchestra here? Why is there a library? Why is there a swimming pool? Why is there anything that creates any kind of community? So I think the most important thing is to kind of make that case for why is music a good thing? Why are the arts a good thing? Why should there be an orchestra in the local community? Because, of course, once an orchestra let's say, dies, I don't think it's coming back. And that's the most important thing that everybody needs to remember, that yes, there are always economic difficulties, particularly in the last 15 years on both sides of the Atlantic. But actually, once the orchestra's not there, to make a case for something that doesn't exist is, you're like, there's that famous Mahler quote, swimming upstream with only one arm. It's going to be very difficult. So I think the community outreach, it's not so much just the sort of putting the badge on and saying I'm reaching out to the community, but actually working out who's there that doesn't know that there's an orchestra. Who in the community, for example, used to be part of the orchestra, or at least used to know that the orchestra was there, but stopped coming to the orchestra. What is it? And I think, of course, you can't please everybody at any one time. It's like any kind of political leader. You're not going to please everybody. You have to compromise between what's available. But I think the biggest thing is you have to make a case for why there is an orchestra, and in some way you have to hope that people will answer that message and come in. And of course that extends to education as well as anything else.
In the States, sometimes a major city has just one professional orchestra. Usually that's the case. And then there are a bunch of other community orchestras and semi-pro groups where you have some professionals, but a lot of community members who just volunteer their time. What's the case in Europe and the UK? Because I know London has, 5 or 6 maybe professional orchestras. Do they have community orchestras as well?
Yeah, I mean, the UK has an enormous tradition of amateur orchestras, which is kind of what we call community orchestras. It doesn't mean amateur in any kind of negative sense. It just means that the people, they work in the bank, and then on Thursday night they get together and they play. And I think, it's a bit like having a reading club or a book club, or going to play football on a Thursday night. It's a kind of social cohesion thing, which is really important. I mean, the very concept of an orchestra is in itself something which I think everyone should aspire to, which is lots of different people doing different things, but designed to come together in some sort of harmonic sense. So we have that same tradition. I think possibly we have particularly in London, we have a lot of orchestras that are linked to certain sectors of work. So for example, there's a supermarket chain called Waitrose, and they have their own orchestra. So employees of the supermarket play in an orchestra, and it's a great way for, first of all, for young conductors to work with orchestras, because obviously it's very difficult to get experience as a conductor, but also because the emphasis isn't on putting on the best performance of a Mozart symphony that week. The emphasis is on the social aspect, and so in that respect, as a conductor, it's almost like you're asked to do different things, and so you learn. In a way, it's the same job. You're dealing with human beings and people, and how do you get the best out of a group of people, but in a way that isn't the sort of dictatorial way that people sometimes think of conductors. So that's fun. I mean, we also have in the UK a big tradition of kind of summer festival opera, but also festivals like the Proms. And sometimes I always feel like actually the best time to be in the UK is probably the summer, from around, we call it the summer, but it's not necessarily the weather, but from around May until August, September, when you can go and see the best orchestras in the world in the Royal Albert Hall for £5, or I think it's now £6, which is about $8 or something like that. And then on top of that, you've got these fantastic country house operas all around, particularly the south of the UK, where people come and listen to opera, and they bring their picnics, and you get this incredible showcase of talent. It's a very varied kind of landscape, the UK. We're between the American model and the European model, because we do have a significant amount of public arts council type funding, but also we have a system of patronage as well. So of course, if there's nobody there to financially support the organization, then it probably won't exist for as long as it should. And so it's quite a nice balance between the two, because on the one sense, the society is essentially saying, yes, we really should have an orchestra, so we're going to fund it through taxes and everything like that. But at the same time, they're saying, well, if you want to have this orchestra, then you also have to pay for it. So it's between the two systems, which I enjoy. I think it's quite a good way of doing things.
Yeah, with U.S. specifically, since I've worked with a lot of community amateur orchestras, there's so many different levels. You know, for example, about 6 or so years ago, I worked with an amateur orchestra as an assistant conductor, but that was a huge community orchestra that their concerts were sold out for like 1,200 seat concert hall, and
Wow.
they had people like Gil Shaham and others who are famous, you know, musicians, you know, come through and play with our orchestra. So there's just such a big variety in the States, especially from really amateur orchestras that almost feels like just a hangout place where people come together and play some music, to actual just really big organizations that have executive directors, but at the same time they perform, you know, 4 or 5 times a year, but at a very, very high level. I was gonna ask about music education and professional orchestras, because you really enjoyed what Bernstein did with his young people's concerts and everything that he's done. Do you see a lot of that happening in Europe, or have you come across it in the States? Because I feel like that's lacking a little bit. There's all kinds of educational programs, but I don't see the actual face of the organization, the music director, participating actively in those programs.
I think it depends on the orchestra. I mean, what I think is good is that I can't think of an orchestra that I know also in Europe, but also in the States, that doesn't participate in some kind of educational outreach program, which is a great situation to be in. You know, and so I think in that respect, it's a very healthy time to be a young person in a town with an orchestra, because there's stuff going on. I think the thing I find difficult is a lot of people assume that a youth orchestra's job is to prepare like professional musicians for the future. But actually, I don't think that's the job at all. I think the most important thing is that we're providing, first of all, well-rounded humans. Yes. I mean, that's one thing. Yeah. But also that we're basically securing a future concert audience, you know, in 50 years' time. You know, we all know the argument of, you know, the slightly aging audience that orchestras tend to have. And, you know, the eternal question is, how do we make sure we're replacing the aging audience, or at least maintaining an average age? And so I think youth orchestras are probably the most important thing to do that. But in terms of that, I mean, I think, I don't know about music directors specifically. I think, generally speaking, that's work that's left to younger conductors. Yeah. But in a way, I also think that's good, because why would a 65-year-old man be the person that's supposed to, you know, interact with the public? Yeah. I think, you know, that again, and it goes beyond the kind of the horrible stereotypes that we do have. I mean, I say 65-year-old man, that's the stereotype of a conductor that we all have in our heads, which is sad, but that's how it is. But what I think is important is, you know, that should be a platform for young conductors of all genders, of all backgrounds, you know, who, okay, of course it's their work and it's their experience to conduct a great orchestra, but also that already gives the profile of conductors can look different. And I think that's also quite a good part of that, because if the younger generation are constantly seeing education concerts like that, then those kind of stereotypes will go quickly, which is the goal.
Well, as a music director, as a conductor, I want to ask you about diversity in programming specifically, because especially in the States, I've come across people who really are active about, you know, having diverse programming and, you know, talk about all the different composers from all over the world, gender, and all the different things. But sometimes I've ran into a couple of conductors that have told me that it's a difficult thing to do. I want to get your perspective. What does it take to have a diverse program? How can you approach programming a diverse, you know, concert? What does it take? Have you thought about these things, and what would it take for you to do something like that, to make it a diverse program?
Well, I think it's very, very difficult, because, you know, we're in the business of, in some way, of historical music. You know, most of our repertoire could be 200 years old, could be 100 years old. And so we only have that 95 or 90% of that to work with. And also, particularly in the United States, but also in Europe, our audiences are coming to hear music that they often want to listen to and music that they already know.
Second or third time or fourth time.
Well, that's it, yeah. And so it makes it very difficult because if you have an orchestra with 6 or 7 subscription concerts a season, then you probably want to maybe go to Austria or Germany, Brahms symphony, maybe then something Russian, maybe something American and 20th century. By the time you get to the end of your season, you've run out of opportunities to do different things. And so I think, in some way, the way to do it is either to focus on something, whether it's like a festival, a week festival or a 2-week festival where you specifically focus on the music of a particular country or a particular background or a particular time. Or what you do is you start to bring in, the odd overture that might fit with a more traditional program, and so that you are creating the diversity within a whole evening, And I'm doing a really interesting concert next year in Dublin with the RTE National Symphony Orchestra, which is a program of just Irish composers.
Wow.
Which sounds easy, but actually it's quite difficult to put that together because you're restricting yourself to not a huge span of maybe even a much less than a century in terms of the repertoire that we have, but also you're trying to create an entertaining evening, which people who might not come to the concert, there's nothing on the program that kind of says to them, you come and listen to this great symphony that everybody knows. And so that does make it difficult. But I think having that in there, hopefully, people will come out of curiosity. And the more that the audiences have a curiosity, I think the more chance they have to kind of be exposed and be open to different repertoire ideas.
Amazing. I do hope that there's a lot of diverse programming happening around the world, but it's also difficult. For example, Fanny Mendelssohn wrote an overture, and it was also very expensive to rent that overture to even perform it. So for youth orchestras or smaller orchestras or community orchestras that don't have big funding, it makes it difficult for them to rent a bunch of pieces that season. So it's just such a tough situation to be in. That's why sometimes it's easier to just program a symphony that you could just have access to for free, without renting it. Yeah. So it's a difficult thing. So another thing that I want to get your perspective on, and maybe for young conductors or people who are interested to know more about what it takes to be a conductor, how is it working with the soloist? What does it take to work with the soloist? What's the approach? Do you meet with the soloist before? Just your ideas on that.
Yeah, I think the most important thing that you have to know as a conductor with soloists, but also it's the same when you're working with singers, is it's their show, let's say, and so you have to. There's always compromise, but actually, it's the concerto for this instrument and this person and this. So I think as a conductor, you have to. It's actually quite a difficult thing to learn. You as much as you have to have a very strong opinion as to how the music goes, you actually have to be quite elastic about that. Yeah. And for example, with opera, you end up in a situation where you realize that actually the allergy levels in London that day are actually quite high, and the pollen count is really high. So the singer's going to have a harder time breathing. So therefore, you have to do something slightly different with tempo or with phrasing. And so I think it's a little bit like being an Uber driver. You're helping them. Yeah. You're driving the car, but it's their journey, and so it's quite a difficult, subtle thing. But again, it's about being accommodating and actually, to be completely honest, these days I think orchestras are full of such incredible soloist players that actually if you're working with really good orchestras, you develop that sense from the fantastic players that you get to work with. You're almost accompanying them and allowing them to be their best rather than dictating anything.
So something a little bit outside of music. I want to know, and maybe I asked you this the first time we did this, but tell me something outside of music that you do, because I know you do a lot of music, but what does George Jackson do outside of music?
Well, I like cooking, basically. So I'm a very keen amateur chef, let's say.
Oh, wow.
And so, I mean, in fact, right now I've got a tagine on. I'm doing a beef tagine.
Wow.
With almonds, and I've got some dates in there, and then like some onions and coriander and stuff. So I really, when I've got a day off, and actually today, luckily I have a day off. I kind of, I don't know, I read a lot, particularly read the newspapers, but also I tend to try and read a lot of factual, more sort of like non-fiction books. And then, yeah, I really love cooking and kind of planning a menu, or at least a meal. But often, I mean, I like cooking that takes a long time. So a lot of roast, like slow roast type food. I'm not a vegetarian. So, you know, a lamb roast or something. I did a really nice lamb fromage type thing, which had a cheese side thing with it as well, which was cool.
What's your address? What's your address? I'm stopping by.
Yeah, of course. Come over. With the time difference, yeah, you can come over for breakfast tomorrow. If you no, it's I find with cooking, and again, I really don't claim to be any expert, but I find that it's a little bit like music. You're being very creative, but in a quite disciplined, taking care of the details kind of way. And so I think that's probably why a lot of conductors, a lot of musicians do enjoy doing cooking. Whether they're good or not is a whole other thing for you to judge. But
so, how does a son of actors become a conductor? Your parents are actors, right? If I remember reading it.
That's correct. Yeah, that's right. I don't know. I mean, I think in the same way that anybody else becomes a conductor, really. I don't know how much of an influence they had on, or they continued to have on me being a conductor. I mean, I think I grew up in a household that's very open to the idea of pursuing the arts or whatever you want to pursue. And I know that there are a lot of people from all backgrounds who, you know, the very idea that they'll pursue something like music for a job is itself something that people don't really support. So that, I suppose, having that support there is a great thing. But again, sometimes I also feel like it's still my own little secret world of orchestras and opera and stuff, just purely because, you know, they know about it a little bit, but still don't know it, you know, to the same extent that somebody from a musical family might know.
So I've asked this question to some conductors, a little bit of an older generation, but I've said, is it tougher at your time, or is it tougher now to be a conductor? Now you're younger compared to them, but is it going to get easier or tougher to be a conductor?
I think it's a really difficult thing because I've heard a lot of comedians actually talk about this question in the context of being a stand-up comedian, and a lot of them say, you know, 20 years ago it was so easy, there was nobody doing comedy, and now suddenly everyone wants to be a stand-up comedian. And I imagine it's the same with conducting. I imagine that there are more people specifically going to, I mean, there are probably more courses and things around the world to specifically go and study conducting. So that probably makes it harder, that the marketplace is probably flooded a little bit more. But then I also think that I think there's still a kind of a difficulty of finding great conductors. And I think that, you know, the kinds of sort of not just sort of great conductors, but real cultural ambassadors in the public eye, people like Leonard Bernstein, and even someone like Kurt Masur in what was East Germany. You know, these were figures that weren't just involved in being a conductor and musicians, but actually involved in all aspects of a community. Again, I mean, it answers your question about being a music director a little bit, but I don't know, I feel like there still aren't that many of them coming through. In a way, is probably means that it's, I don't know, I think it's probably just as hard to find those. You know, I think it's probably fair to say that orchestras are getting better. People make that argument a lot. And I suppose as orchestras get better, good conductors are actually less importance. Yeah. Because so many orchestras can just play on their own and do play on their own. And the identification of what makes a good conductor gets more and more difficult. So I don't know. It's a question which I think I'll never know. But I think when I look back at even just the last 5 years, you know, there's still luck taking its part many aspects of any career that's developing. And so, is luck an easy thing or a hard thing? I mean, that's impossible to say. And so that depends on the individual,
Yeah, luck is a big part. But you said something about master classes and courses that happen around the world. And one thing that I sometimes am a bit frustrated with are all the master classes that are happening around the world, and there aren't just as many jobs opening. And another aspect of master classes is how much they cost. And I understand we have to pay the teachers, and there's so much that goes into it, but there's just so many people who can't afford those master classes, even if they do get in. Your take on that? What do you suggest? Do you have those same frustrations, or what would you suggest for the future? Maybe if you were to make an ideal world.
Yeah, well, I think masterclass is a difficult thing because for me, masterclass, the most important thing is master in that description of an activity, and so in that sense, that you want to be studying with somebody who really is a master.
Yeah.
And so there are some fantastic, famous masterclasses that have happened over the years. The Bernard Haitink masterclass series at Lucerne.
Yeah.
Pierre Boulez also used to run a similar thing at the Lucerne Festival in the summer. Obviously, a conductor like Robert Spano, who was a very close mentor of mine, continues to run the Aspen Music Festival. For me, that's what a masterclass means. And I see a lot of masterclasses in inverted commas with conductors whose names I've never heard of.
Yeah.
They might be masters, but the idea that you might pay a lot of money to go and study with somebody it's not necessarily about fame, but usually I think there's a reason why somebody is the principal conductor of the London Symphony Orchestra.
Yeah.
Because they're a master of their what they do, and so it's very difficult. And I think actually to go back to the acting profession, there's a lot of courses, and actually the LA kind of world of acting is much more like this than London, but it's starting to happen in London as well, and also in New York. This idea of actors constantly taking classes when they're unemployed, often it's very expensive, but it keeps them kind of involved, and of course, out-of-work actors also teach the classes as well as take the classes. So I think there's something very healthy about being in a master class where primarily you're with colleagues, because I think of all the friends that I've met through doing master classes, whether the teachers are masters or not is one thing. They've become really important and great colleagues who I'm in touch with, and as we know, it's a very lonely job. You don't work with other conductors. Yeah. So I think, the idea of going to, the Czech Republic or Romania or Bulgaria or one of these kinds of master classes that run throughout the summer that are very popular, I think it's a great thing to do, because actually it gives you an opportunity to get to know an orchestra and often to get to know other conducting colleagues. And at the end of the day, I think usually it's other conductors who are the ones that are going to help you out with your career and with work than anybody else. And so that network of colleagues is one of the most important things that you can ever develop as a conductor. So I think in that respect, those masterclasses are really, really important. And I'm not sure about how much you should pay for them or not. This comes back to a question of education, which, obviously in America, it's a lot more expensive to go to university than it is in Germany or in Austria or in the UK. But I think at the end of the day, you're investing in part of your development, and I don't know what the price is. Obviously, any kind of scam where you don't get what you're paying for is a bad thing. Yeah. There are a lot of competitions like that, which I think are to be avoided. But generally speaking, I think if it's a chance to conduct an orchestra, a real-life orchestra, as well as have colleagues and perhaps learn something, then I think that's a good thing.
And you said something about competitions, and that's a different thing. But you said, conductors help each other, and all, but there's also competition happening there as well, a little bit, don't you think? Between conductors. I don't think there is a competition. Well, I mean, principally, yes, there is a sense of competition in the sense that there are lots of people competing for one job or one invitation or something. But the thing I've started to realize about the way that the whole business works is that actually, if your colleagues do well, often you end up doing well as well, because, for example, let's say that there's a young British conductor who suddenly explodes onto the scene, and then lots of orchestras invite them,
and then they actually can't take on those engagements anymore. So they think, okay, well, we need someone with a similar profile, or we have a kind of a more experimental concert series that we can give to a younger conductor. Yeah. So we go to the next person down the list. And so often, I don't know, I feel like much more it's so unhealthy to think of it as competitive. And actually, you know, we are all colleagues at the end of the day. And it would be really lovely if, I mean, yeah, there's competition in every industry, but I think actually that it's really healthy, and I think it's good to kind of celebrate people's colleagues' successes, because I don't know, I think it's sort of an anarchistic job in some way. You know, nobody knows what they want specifically or what happens, and it's often luck and lots of different things that allow things to move forward. So you have to kind of, you know, it's like being in a casino and the guy next to you wins a lot and you lose. I mean, you can't be jealous or you can't be competitive. It's just part of the game that you've chosen to be in a little bit.
That's amazing. That's a really healthy way of thinking about it. I like that.
Good.
We're at 37 minutes now.
Brilliant.
What have we missed? I'm sure we've missed a lot.
I don't know.
And after this, we'll probably tweet or something online and find that there's other things that we should have talked about. I feel like I should start writing a list of things that I want to talk about with people, because I have an idea of what it is. But by the time it gets to that moment, I'm like, I think there was another thing that I wanted to talk about and we never got to it. So I don't know if we missed something.
No, I think what's nice is it's a natural conversation. And I think, you know, what's interesting is that to reflect on your podcast specifically, you know, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and again, most of the ones I listen to are sort of like, you know, creative conversation type podcasts between actors or comedians or directors. And I think that there's just not that much of it in the music world, particularly in the classical music world. And in a way, I hope that changes, because I think that it's, you know, especially conductors, we don't make any sound in our job. You know, we conduct, they play, we go home, maybe we talk to the audience, but generally speaking, people are quite mysterious and sometimes curious about who we are and what we do. And so the idea of any conductor engaging in a long conversation with another conductor, I mean, there should be more of that, because I think it's healthy. It's quite healthy for me too, because it makes me think. It's like when you teach, you suddenly realize that you think about what you do and slightly analyze what your job actually is in a really interesting way.
Yeah. And no, I really love talking to you, and I love following what you do, because you're a positive person. At least it seems that way. Maybe you're just negative when you turn off the camera, but you're a very positive person, and you're also a thinker, which I love, because there are so many people that have thought so much about music, and they're absolutely fantastic. Just some of the smartest people I've met really know music, really know about the history and the music and everything, but sometimes I can't consider them thinkers. And I know you're a thinker because you not only know music so well, but you also have thought about all the things that take to be a conductor, a musician in the 21st century, and not just with the music, but beyond the music. And that's why I love talking to you, and I love following your Twitter and Facebook and all those things that you do. So it's just great having you. I love talking to you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, the feeling's very mutual.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm sure we'll do this again. If you're ever in the States conducting again, hopefully on the West Coast, we'll get together and do this in person.
Yeah, so the third time we do it will be a live in-person one.
I hope so. I've rarely even done these a second time. So you're one of the few people that I've even had for
I'm
a
very
second
honored.
time. No, it's great.
Very
no,
honored.
it's great. It's always great talking to you. I'm happy we did this. So thank you so much for being on Off the Podium. We'll talk again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.